Most people are not afraid of noise. They're afraid of silence. Because silence does something that constant distraction cannot. It forces people to face themselves, without filters, without buffers, without the familiar hum of avoidance dressed up as productivity. And for many people, that feeling is unbearable. Watch what happens when a conversation suddenly goes quiet. Not awkward quiet. Not natural pause quiet. But the kind of silence that lingers. Most people rush to fill it. With words, jokes, explanations, nervous laughter, unsolicited stories. Anything to escape the tension. But here's what's fascinating. The rush to break silence is almost never about the other person. It's about the person speaking. Because in silence, they become hyper-aware of their own presence, their own emotional state, their own discomfort. And that awareness, however brief, feels unbearable. Silence creates exposure. Think about it. When a room is quiet, you hear your own heartbeat. When a conversation pauses, you feel your own nervous system. When you sit alone without input, you become aware of your anxiety, your insecurity, your unprocessed thoughts, your emotional discomfort, the stories you tell yourself, without the noise to drown them out. And many people have spent their entire lives building a shield against that exact feeling. They've trained themselves, not for presence, but for permanent avoidance. And silence threatens the entire architecture. Modern life is built around interruption, notifications, music, algorithms, scrolling, endless content. Conversations designed to fill space, not create meaning. Silence removes all of it, and suddenly, the mind has nowhere to go. No phone to check. No video to watch. No voice to listen to. No distraction to hide behind. Just you and your thoughts. And for someone who has never learned to sit with themselves, that confrontation feels like a threat. Here's something most people don't realize. Many people don't use distraction for entertainment. They use it for emotional regulation, or more accurately, emotional suppression. Noise becomes anesthesia. Podcasts, music, constant conversation, background TV, the hum of a feed that never ends. Because staying mentally occupied feels easier than sitting with unresolved emotions. And the moment you take that away, the wound reopens. Not because the silence is painful, but because silence reveals what the noise was covering. Silence also changes social dynamics in a way most people don't consciously notice. In any conversation, the person most uncomfortable with silence usually loses control first. They overtalk, overexplain, fill gaps with unnecessary detail, seek reassurance through words, become reactive to the pause, while the calm person simply observes. And here's the truth. The person who breaks silence first is often the person with the least emotional leverage. Because silence is not emptiness. Silence is a mirror, and the person who can sit in it comfortably holds the greater psychological position. Watch two people during tension. The first person becomes restless immediately. They shift in their seat, glance at their phone, speak faster, laugh at things that aren't funny, fill every micropause with unnecessary commentary. They're not communicating anymore. They're soothing themselves through noise. The second person remains still, comfortable with silence, comfortable with waiting, comfortable with eye contact that doesn't need explanation. They don't rush. They don't rescue the conversation. They don't absorb the other person's discomfort. And instantly, the emotional balance changes. The restless person feels exposed. The calm person feels centered. And without a single word being spoken, the power dynamic has shifted. People who are emotionally grounded usually tolerate silence well. But because silence does not threaten them, they don't need external validation to feel okay. They don't need constant input to regulate their nervous system. They can sit in the unknown without needing to control it. But people carrying untreated anxiety, unprocessed emotion, constant validation needs, unresolved trauma, fragile sense of self, often experience silence as psychological discomfort, because silence forces them into a space they've avoided. And avoidance, however comfortable, always comes with a cost. Here's something interesting. Silence becomes intimidating when combined with emotional control. Not the silence of shyness, not the silence of disinterest, but the silence of someone who is fully present and completely unreactive. Because a calm, silent person appears difficult to influence, difficult to manipulate, difficult to pressure, difficult to read. And uncertainty, especially in social dynamics, creates tension automatically. People don't know what you're thinking. They don't know how you'll react. They don't know if they have control. And for someone used to filling silence to gain reassurance, your stillness becomes their mirror. Most people can no longer sit alone quietly. Not for 5 minutes. Not for 2. Not even for 30 seconds. The moment silence appears, their hand reaches for the phone. Their brain searches for a song. Their mouth opens to start a conversation. Not because silence is painful, but because stillness reveals what distraction hides. And if someone has been running from themselves for years, stopping feels dangerous. Let's name it directly. Many people are addicted to stimulation. Not in the dramatic sense, but in the quiet, normalized, everyday sense. They cannot eat a meal without a screen. They cannot drive without a podcast. They cannot shower without music. They cannot sit in a waiting room without scrolling. And every time they reach for external input to avoid internal reality, they reinforce the same cycle. Avoidance, temporary relief, deeper avoidance, reduced tolerance for stillness. Until eventually, the silence is unbearable. Not because it's loud, but because they've forgotten how to be alone with themselves. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people will never say out loud. Some people avoid silence their entire lives. They structure their days around noise. They fill relationships with chatter. They surround themselves with constant input, not because they love stimulation, but because silence exposes everything they've been trying not to feel. And the tragedy is this: the very thing they're running from can only be healed in the silence. And here's what changes everything. The ability to sit quietly without needing constant stimulation has quietly become rare. Most people cannot do it. Most people have never trained it. Most people actively avoid it. That's why calm silence now feels powerful. Because in a world addicted to noise, the person who can be still becomes magnetic. Not because they're mysterious, because they're rare. If you want to reclaim this ability, here's where to start. Step 1. Practice micro-stillness. Start with 1 minute a day. No phone. No music. No conversation. Just sitting. Build tolerance slowly. Step 2. Stop rescuing silence. In conversations, let the pause breathe. Don't rush to fill it. Notice your impulse to speak, and sit with it instead. Step 3. Watch your avoidance triggers. When you instinctively reach for your phone, pause. Ask, what am I trying not to feel right now? Step 4. Differentiate presence from performance. You don't need to be interesting all the time. You don't need to entertain. You don't need to fill space with words. Presence without performance is more powerful than noise with no substance. Step 5. Build emotional tolerance. The more you sit with discomfort, without reacting, the more silence becomes a source of strength instead of anxiety. The people who fear silence most are usually the people trying hardest to escape their own mind. And the people who have mastered silence have stopped running. Most people think silence is empty. But silence reveals more about human behavior than words ever do. Because words are curated. But silence is the truth. Want the next episode? The psychology of people who never ask questions. Because some people aren't quiet because they're shy. They're quiet because they're paying attention.